All right, so I'm gonna aim to finish by 5. And I probably will assign a little bit of work over spring break if you're interested in front end, just because React is a beast of a framework. If you're just starting out web dev, like most of you started just like 4 or 5 weeks ago, whenever we started, I think 4 or 5 weeks ago. And in like the entirety of 10 weeks, if all we taught was React, then you'd understand it. Well, we're only going to spend about 3 weeks on it, so that's why I'm going to assign just an hour and a half of work over spring break, just doing a tutorial. And obviously some additional work if you do want to get familiar with React, because it is extremely powerful. So just to preface a little bit before I start the actual front end lecture, if you're interested in front end or back end, make sure you fill out the form that Alex sent in the Slack by Saturday. All of you must fill it out because we are splitting into front end and back end. But obviously this lecture is kind of a trial period to see if you actually like front end or if you want to check out back end. The back end lecture will also be recorded, so feel free to check it out afterwards and make a choice by Saturday. But if you're at front end, you made the right choice because I personally love front end. All right, so what is front end, back end? I'm sure y'all heard this at last lecture, but I'll just do a quick recap. Front end is everything you see and interact with, like buttons, Facebook, Zoom. Everything you're seeing right now is front end. Everything you don't see, like the data centers full of servers and machines and databases that you can't actually interact with unless you use an API key for Facebook, which you can't get because then they lock out. Like I have experience with that. Hackathon project did not go well. I got locked out of Facebook for a month. But yeah, backend is all of that stuff. Backend is typically where a lot of the logic comes in, where a lot of the data storage and data manipulation goes on, and front end is where all the pretty stuff happens. And that includes UI UX for the most part, making everything work and making everything usable by the user. So users don't have to get and post requests in terminal to see their Facebook feed. All right, so that's a quick recap of that. So now what is React? React is a framework. And just to recap what a framework is, so y'all learned HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And y'all also should have watched the networking lecture. But networking is kind of a standalone topic, so that won't really come up too much. But you have JavaScript, right? And JavaScript is awesome, HTML is awesome, CSS is awesome. But as you guys have probably learned over Project 1, Project 2, they also kind of suck. Like, there's so much stuff that could be improved in HTML and CSS and JavaScript. And there's just so much power that can come with extra tools. And that's where frameworks come in. If you ever use Python, think of a framework as importing NumPy. You could consider NumPy a framework. Basically, it's a set of tools that you can use instead of the standard JavaScript or Python. So React it comes with its own syntax. You import React, and from there you can use all the power that comes with React. So yeah, if you ever use Python, it's like importing a module in Python, except much more transformative than NumPy. React changes the entire way you use JavaScript. And so let's get started with React. So here's a website. I'm creating a React app. And I will walk you through what exactly this will look like and what the power React is and all that good stuff in this lecture. Let's quickly start by, let me just go to the thing. So creating a React app. So y'all should follow along. You all should have Node and NPM installed from the setup homework. If you don't, please after the lecture or during the lecture. It does take a bit of time because it is a large file. So create React app is the best way to bootstrap a React app. And so if you go down here, don't worry about what any of this means. I'll be explaining that later, but you can copy paste this line right here. Go to your terminal, enter that. I already did that. I already have my app in my desktop. Where is it? Wait, did I accidentally? No. Yes, right there. Okay, code my app. Cool. And if you haven't downloaded the VS Code CLI, I'd recommend you can just type it in code whatever into your terminal and it opens up automatically. It looks really cool. But yeah, let's start looking at what exactly React is. So this is a React app, or actually, let me go and open this in the GUI so I can show it a bit more clearly. Okay, does anyone see where my app is? Because I don't. Oh, there it is. I don't know why it's over there. All right, so this is a React app. And so you see a bunch of folders, and none of these look like JavaScript. You see JSON, that's the first 2 letters of JavaScript, but that's not exactly what you're used to, right? So this is a familiar feeling. When you start out learning React, it's very, very different from what you'd expect. It's completely different. If you have experience with Django, for example, it's just completely different. Sure, it's Python, but it's basically like learning a new language. So let's go over what each of these folders are. This is a React app. And so if you go into source, this is where all your actual JavaScript lives, where your CSS lives, where your HTML lives. You can see some familiar files here, right? CSS, JavaScript, CSS, everything you normally see. And this is what actually runs when you create your React app, okay? So when you actually decide to boot up your app and check it out, you actually are running index.js and index.css and everything in the source folder. But you might notice there's no HTML. Let me show you why. So let's go back to VS Code. So go to source and let's open up what our React app is. Like, what do we have here, right? So let's go to terminal, and you can't just click on an HTML file and open it up in the browser because you can see there is no HTML, and we're gonna get to why that is in a minute. So the way you open up a React app is you just run npm start. And we wait for 30 seconds or so. Let's take a while to boot up. And that while, or actually let's wait. So you can see exactly what we have here. You can see me just being sad right here. Or actually, kind of want to open this up in a new window. Yeah, there it is. My local host. All right, so that's that. That's there. Let me minimize this. Okay, there's VS Code. Okay, yeah. So it's just still loading up. It does take a while the first time you do it. Okay, there it is. And this is our React app. Now, where is all this code coming from? Let's find out. So as I said, everything is in source, right? So let's start with index.js. So this doesn't make any sense. So let's go to app.js. And now we get something familiar. This is HTML right here, but it's inside a function and it looks weird. So let's go over what this actually is. So the root file, the file which we actually look at, which this website right here is looking at, is index.js. And here, let's just dissect a little bit. First, we import React from React. So here we're importing React, right? And then we're React DOM.rendering. So we're rendering app. And we see we get app from /app. /app is here. And so we see that we are returning this as part of our function. We're exporting this HTML code. And this is what shows up here, edit source app.js, add source app.js. So we see that we're using HTML, but it's in this weird convoluted way that we're not used to. So let me explain what exactly we're looking at. The power of React is in components. Instead of having 10 HTML files, which are all kind of disparate and you link them amongst each other and get super confusing, with React, you can treat HTML as reusable components, kind of like functions. You know how you can write a addition function once and use it over and over again, or a more complicated function if you ever taken data 8 or data 100, or like if you've ever used NumPy or Pandas, for example, or any sort of Python import, you realize how you use functions to reuse code. So you have to write the same thing over and over again. That's just like HTML. Think about it this way. If you have a website with 10 pages, each with their own HTML file, in regular HTML, you probably have to write the nav bar in each file. And if you want to change one small thing in the nav bar, you have to change that in all 10 files. It'd be much easier if you could just import navbar and just use it as a component, use it as an HTML tag. And that's exactly what React allows you to do. For example, you can create your own components, like I talk about navbar. Right? Let me make navbar.js. And just like regular functions where you reuse code, you still write functions to reuse HTML. So first, let's import React from React. And also feel free to follow along if you want. But I know this can be confusing conceptually when you start learning this stuff. And let's create a function because we want to reuse it. So let's create const navbar. Let's make this an arrow function. In general, I'd recommend using arrow functions in React just because it is lighter. There are two types of ways you can write React, either with functions or classes, but right now I'm just going to cover functions. And if you have time at the end, I'll cover classes. And then next, let's export this function so that can be used in all of our other files. So export default navbar. Don't worry about the difference between export navbar and export default navbar right now, that is something we'll get to in a later lecture probably. But let's just concern ourselves with how exactly React works right now. So let's return what we want to return. Let's return a div with an h1, and let's just say hello world. Cool. So that's our navbar. It's words, not navbar, but just for purposes of this example, it's close enough. Now we want to use our navbar in our app.js. So let's import it, right? So import navbar from /navbar. You don't need to include the .js in React. For all other files, if you want to import a CSS file, you have to include .css or whatever. But for JavaScript files, you don't need to include the .js. And now in order to use our navbar, we have to actually put it in our HTML, right? And basically what we've done is we can use this as a tag. So we can put this right here, just like a regular tag. And the thing about JSX is that you don't need, there's nothing that's going on in navbar, right? Nothing goes into navbar, it's just displaying this code. So we don't need to have it be an open and a close tag. We can make it a self-closing tag, just like that. So now if we save that and go back to our thing, we see hello world, and we have a navbar. And now if we had 10 pages and our navbar had 10 different links, we just import navbar into each of them, put navbar here, and if we wanted to change it, we just change it one time to hello world, for example, right? Or we can add an exclamation mark. So instead of having to change it 10 times, we just have to change it one time. And that's really the main idea behind React, or one of two main ideas, is componentization and reusing code and basically putting inputs into code, for example. So now let me show you something cool in React. So the second, or the 1.5 big, there's a lot of big ideas in React here. Maybe I'm underestimating. But next is being able to pass inputs into your components. So let's say we have a navbar, right? And depending on the page, we want to change what it says. So let's say name, or let's say title equals never mind. Okay, just completely arbitrarily. And so you see here, this is an attribute of our navbar tag. Here, class name is an attribute, source, class name, alt. You guys are all familiar with that. But this one is title. And this is just something we made up. We can name this whatever we want. Okay? So now let's add that to our navbar. So in order for a component to take in something, we have to give it props. And props is short for properties. So you can think of properties as just being things you pass into a component. And now we want to display that, right? So let's give it a P. And here's another really big power of React, is that you can use logic within your HTML. So let's give it props.title. And just to preface, I know this probably doesn't make much sense right now. I'm just trying to show you the main ideas, and let's come back to these later and explain exactly what I'm doing. And now we should be able to see names somewhere, or what we wrote on, never mind. There it is. And if we change that, if we have 10 different pages and we want to give the title to page, for example, this is home, right? Then we can just change it there. And if you go to another page, in that page, when we import React and import navbar, we can give it a different title. Title is also optional. Let's say we remove it. What do you guys think will show up? Nothing. So it's basically just an extra thing you can give it. So I glossed over props pretty quickly. So I'm going to go back to it now. And I also glossed over what these curly brackets in your HTML mean. But I guess before we go into that, any questions? Can you give it a default component if something isn't passed in? Yeah, you can. Props.title or, so this is, if you've taken 61B or 61A, I forget where it teaches, this is like short circuiting, right? So if this is undefined, it'll go on to this looking for a true value, and this is a true value, so it shows home. This is a really jank way to do it. You can also set defaults. So you can deconstruct your props object here to be title, and instead of doing props.title, you can just do title. And here you can do title equals home, kind of like how you do a default value in a function. All right, any questions before I explain further what exactly I just did? All right, if not, let me explain what exactly I'm doing here. So I said just before this that one of the big powers of React is that you can use logic in your JavaScript, right? So instead of like just writing, oh, that's a mistake. Instead of just writing 5, let's say you have a variable here. So you can put logic before the return statement because you're returning HTML, right? So let's just do regular JavaScript. Let's do const x equals 5. And so before this, we had 5 here, but let's say we want to just change x based on the mood, you know, maybe we're feeling like 7, maybe for like 2. And so this is always 5, but we want to change it. So in order to put a variable into your HTML, you have to put it around curly brackets. And now we can put an x. And now you'll do the exact same thing. You can see here that we'll get a 5. And that's fine. It's the same result because we're not changing it. But let's say we want to, we're just feeling like x, we just decide to make x equals 8. And in order to change that, we have to change that to not a const. That's 8, right? So while this may seem super simple, this lets you change what's shown based on user input. Before I had to do, like, you had to give an ID, and you had to do document.get element by ID, and you had to change it based on JavaScript logic. Instead of doing all that stuff where you're directly interacting with the elements and the class names, you can just write JavaScript here, and have it show up here as a variable. Does that make sense? All right, cool. And so now to go back to properties, now that you've learned that you can use variables in JavaScript. So properties are the same as attributes, basically. So you should have learned that these things, class name, alt, href, target, rel, these are all attributes of tags. And in React, you can create your own custom attributes. So I can give this, even in regular HTML, you can create your own custom attributes. You can do like that equals that. It's completely meaningless, but you can. It's not going to affect your code. It'll show up when you inspect element, but won't change anything. However, if you have a custom component, then you can actually access these really random or made up attributes that you give it. And these are called properties because they're properties of the tag. So you saw here that I can change this to props, is how it's typically given. And props is an object. So you can access .title, for example. But let's say we just want to just drive the point home. So let's just give it something completely random. And let's also log out what props is. Let's go here. Let's inspect element. It's bigger. All right, console, and we get an object. And this is our props object. And so we see here, right, the two attributes you gave it, test and title. And so you can actually access these just how you'd access a regular object as a variable. Here, props.title, home, home. If I want to show props.test, I just give it a variable with curly brackets around it, props.test, test, it would show whatever this is. So that's what properties is. Does that make sense so far? Properties is a big idea to grasp. It's like data flow. You know, in JavaScript and HTML and CSS, you haven't really encountered data flow as much. It's more directly changing what's on the page. However, with React, you get much more data flow. So React has a much more back-end feel because you get much more power out of it. So yeah, any questions so far? All right, if not, we'll move on to the next concept, which is state. And yeah, just to reiterate again and again, these things don't have to make sense now. I'll be assigning a tutorial. The official tutorial on the React website is great for really solidifying these concepts. It's just great to hear these from the point of view of analogy and what you've learned in your computer science courses so far. Just the React app. The React tutorial kind of shows you the rope, so it doesn't really show you the reasoning behind all these things. I'll also be assigning a 5-hour course, completely optional, unlike the 1-hour tutorial, which I highly recommend. It's only 1 hour and super great. But a 5-hour course can really help you solidify what I'm saying right now. And as in most things, the earlier you start learning React, the better you'll be at it, just because React is huge. To give you an indicator of how big React is in terms of software skills, outside like Google Slides and all that stuff, React was the #1 most requested coding language from employers. It opens up a world of opportunities for you because with React, you can do pretty much anything. React is basically a front end and a back end if you can use it properly. So yeah, with that being said, let's create another component. So we have a nav bar. Let's create a footer.js, right? So our steps are import React from React. That's not React. React. Okay, cool. Okay, cool. So Raider ideas, footer. And we're not taking any props here because we want the footer to be static. Arrow function returns div h1 footer. And export default footer. And as last time, we can, let me just hide the floating meeting controls just not getting in the way. All right, we can use a footer, and or the footer and down here. And we should get a footer. Nice. So a quick miscellaneous thing, everything in your HTML that you return from a function must be inside one container. So for example, let's say we want to put footer outside of the div. It's not going to work because it's not inside. See, JSX expression must have one parent element. So ignore what JSX is for now. We're just talking about HTML. One parent element means everything must be inside one giant container. So here's our div with app. But if you want to, you can also take this away and just make this an empty tag, which is also an option in React. And it's perfectly fine. So you compile successfully. But it's the same as making the div for the most part. And so next, I'm going to quickly talk about JSX. All this stuff here is in HTML. You know, I've been lying to you this whole time. HTML, you can include custom tags. JSX is basically the React version of HTML that allows you to create custom tags and use variables in your HTML. Because in HTML, all these things are showing you aren't there. So technically this is JSX, but for the most part, you can just think of it in HTML. And it'll behave the exact same way. So I've been calling it HTML, but technically it's JSX. So I'll refer to it as JSX. That's why you saw the error message said JSX expressions must have a one parent element. And here you can also see JSX thing. I think I have I'm not sure if this comes pre-installed, but you can see like all the details of everything. But yeah, this is a JSX element. This is a div, you see in HTML. This is JSX. This is also JSX. This whole thing is JSX. You return JSX from a React function. So now that you've learned how imports works and custom components work, let's see what index.js is now. So you import React, and then you import app, and you serve app. React.strict mode, we don't import, we import React, and strict mode is a part of React. It's a custom tag that comes with React. So you throw that around your app, and then you render it to the DOM. Yeah, okay, before I go further, does that make sense? I'll try to leave ample room for questions, just because I know there's probably a lot of questions. Feel free to put them in the chat. Feel free to DM me if you don't want to ask everyone. Yeah, if you guys completely understand 100% of this up to now, I'll be very surprised. But good for you.
What's React.strict mode?
Okay, yeah. So React.strict mode is basically a wrapper around your entire app. You can see here that throws an error if you use legacy code. So React is constantly evolving. I think we're in React version 3 or 4. I might be completely off. I might be 12. I don't remember. But it just throws an error if you use something from version 1 that's deprecated. So certain methods or classes or hooks, as you'll learn soon, might be deprecated. And if you use any of those deprecated features, it'll throw an error. So this is just to make sure you don't use any super old features.
Cool.
Yeah, any other questions?
Can you explain what React DOM is again?
Oh yeah, I was actually gonna do that next. Perfect. Okay, so you can see here in our app and navbar and JavaScript that we're just returning HTML, right? But index looks a little bit different. We're not returning any function. That's because index is what's actually served. And we can't just expect the browser to know what React is. The browser typically comes with JavaScript, but doesn't necessarily come with React unless we tell it to. So React DOM.render, or let's start here. Some of you might find this familiar, document.get element by ID, root. And so this is going to take us into journey of what exactly everything else in this folder is. So let's go to public. Oh, look, an actual HTML file. So we do have HTML in React. It's just there to make things displayed, because you can't display a JavaScript file. At the end of the day, you have to display an HTML file. That's how the web works. So how React does it is, you have your head, your meta tags, all that stuff. And here in your body, you have two things. You have this, which is unnecessary, and this is what matters. You have a singular div, an empty div, with ID root. And you can see here in your JavaScript, you should have done this in project 2, I think, that you get the element root. And so now that you have this div here, what React DOM.render does is it basically adds all of this code inside of this div right here. So app.js, all these contents, everything in navbar footer based on here. So just to give some context, you can just replace navbar right here with this code directly, and it'll work fine. But we don't want to do that to write less code, right? But basically, it's replacing all these custom components that you're writing, app, navbar, footer, and all this logic, all these variables, everything into just plain HTML and JavaScript. And that's what React DOM.render does. For example, if you go to elements, you can see there's nothing special. It just looks exactly like regular HTML. You have your div root and you have your div app. Now, why is this bugging out? All right, I hope that's better. You have your app like we showed earlier. What? Yeah, see? Here you have your div, which we had navbar. Here's our navbar. Here's our footer. Here's our app. It's all under div. And all the JavaScript is just around stuff. You don't need to worry about how it generates. React kind of takes care of that for you. That's why you use frameworks. You don't have to worry about all that specific stuff yourself. But yeah, React DOM.render is basically just doing all that stuff. You document .getElement by ID, and you're appending everything in app and strict mode to your div in index.html with root, so that it actually works with the web. Just because the web doesn't serve JavaScript files, it serves HTML files. And React is a super powerful framework, but can't fundamentally change how the web works, right? So we still have to work with how the web is structured, but we can just do it in a way that makes our lives easier. All this stuff in React you can do with regular JavaScript and HTML and CSS, but it's a pain in the ass. So doing it with React makes our lives a lot easier. Does that make sense? All right, so let's go back to our index.html. All this other stuff you can kind of ignore for now. And so you can see everything here should be familiar, right? You have React app title, we have meta tags, all that stuff. If you want to add meta tags, such as a component library like Bootstrap or something, or you want to add Google fonts, anything like that, you can add it in your index.html. So what is all this other stuff? So app.css, just a regular CSS file. If you want to use CSS inside your React, you just import the file. All a bit different, but pretty straightforward. Just a logo, navbar. You don't need to worry about what these two are for now. .ignore, not super important. So our next thing we're going to look at is package.json. So there are a couple important things I want to explain here. There are 4 important things actually. Package.json source, which we already talked about, public, which we already talked about, and node modules. So package.json and node modules are pretty connected. So package.json basically contains all the information about what is required to make your app work. So you can see the name is my app. You can change this to version, private, all this basic information. And dependencies is where we really start understanding what React is. So you can see that React is a dependency of our app because it's a dependency of what we need to use in order to make our app work. And you can see here we import React from React. So this is just a package we're using. We're not doing anything amazing other than JavaScript. We're just importing something from something we downloaded already. We downloaded React already, and we're importing React from what we downloaded. It's really just a package. It's not anything special, it's not anything super special, it's just an import, right? Here we get React DOM, here we get some other cool testing libraries, all that stuff, all these dependencies. Scripts, so we saw npm start earlier. These are things you can run to CLI. If you run npm in front of it, you can do all this stuff. npm start starts up your app in the browser. npm build creates a build version, which you can serve to the web when you actually want to host it on a website, but that comes later. Test is if you have tests. We don't have tests because I'm lazy. I don't test stuff. Eject, never use eject unless you have a very specific reason to. Eject takes you out of the create React app boilerplate, which I'll explain in a second. There's a lot of it. I'll explain this in a second here, but there's just a lot to cover. It's kind of disparate. But don't use eject unless you have a very specific reason to. All this other stuff is not super important. You can ask me about it later if you want, but yeah. And on node modules, it's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of stuff. Are we going to worry about this? No, never worry about node modules. Also, never actually push node modules to Git. You can see here node modules is in your Git ignore. Never push node modules to Git. This is by far the largest file here. And this contains all the dependencies. So React has a bunch of dependencies. It's not just like one giant code file with like a million lines. It uses all these different packages to work. And so it's not like you just magically import React and you're good. You have to download all of the code that comes along with React too. And then you can use it as React. But behind the scenes, React actually has a bunch of stuff holding it up, just because React has a bunch of power to it. So I just really want to dispel like all of the notion that React is just a magical thing you can import and we're all happy and, I don't know, butterfly fishing or whatever. We actually had to download all the code that makes this possible. All these custom components, all these variables, we had to download all the code. It's right here. Never worry about how it works, unless I guess you really want to. But none of this is magical. We have all the code to make this work here, and it's a lot of code. But in the end, it makes our lives easier, and we don't have to look at it. So yeah, does it make sense so far? All right, so now let's go back to create React app, which is how we create this React app earlier. So all you need for React is technically an index.js, a package.json with React, node modules kind of comes along with it, and then there's something in here. You can replace app with just a single div, and it's fine, right? But we have a bunch of this stuff: report web vitals, setup tests, a README, CSS, app, all these random stuff. Like we have a bunch of extra boilerplate. And that's what we get from create React app. Whenever you're starting a new React project and you want to create a React app, don't try and create it from scratch. Previously with HTML and CSS, you were creating an HTML file, you're creating a CSS file, right? JavaScript, you're creating a JavaScript file. But here you want this boilerplate because if you don't use this boilerplate, your life becomes much harder. Because you saw here that we got all these testing things built in, we got all these scripts built in, I've had to write these scripts from scratch before. I didn't understand any of it, and I frankly don't want to understand any of it. But like, for example, writing the start, that's how we just show it here, right? This is like a bajillion lines of code if you do it yourself. But if you use create React app, then you get it for free. And it's pretty simple. You just copy this line of code, you replace my app with whatever you want your folder to be named, and you're good. What is NPX? Some of you may ask. Don't worry about it. It's a thing. Kind of like NPM, slightly different. You can look into it if you want. Not super important. We might talk about it later, but maybe not. As I said, we're really trying to emphasize the core concepts here just because React, all these details I'm glossing over can take a lot of time to talk about. And we just don't have that much time. So yeah, always use create React app. You get this exact file structure and you get all these extra things with it, which are awesome, right? So yeah, so far I've covered create React app, the anatomy of React app, custom components, and props, along with package.json and node modules. So that is a lot, and I kind of glossed over all of them. How does this sound so far? Or is everybody following? All right, I see 1 thumbs up. 3, 4, okay, 4 thumbs up. Okay, that's good. All right, so next I will quickly cover some, let's see, there's 2 pets I can go to. Yeah, I'm gonna code. Okay, so let's go to our nav bar, right? So here we had x equals 5, x equals 8. Cool, it's still static. But we want the user to be able to change what happens. And that's where state comes in. So there are 2 main ways that data can flow in React. That's props and state. So props or properties are more static, as in you pass them in here, and they're more for having data flow from high to low. So app is the higher level component, navbar is a lower level component, right? And we want data to flow from app to navbar, so we use props for making data flow between components. Okay, so because like if I want to change home based on a higher level component, for example, my home is a higher level component, my about page is a higher level component, we can pass the data to navbar, which is a lower level component. But let's say we want data to be contained within a component. For example, the classic way to start running React is let's create a button where every time the user clicks the button, this variable x right here increases by 1. So to do that, let's create hooks. And this is going to be very confusing. I'm warning you all, but bear with me. So let's import. So this is where state comes in, right? So I talk about props being a way to pass data from one component to the other. State is a way to use data within the component. And you can also pass state between components, but state is more how you use actual logic. Props is just for passing around numbers and variables and data. State is for actually manipulating data, if that makes sense. So this is not gonna make any sense, but let's just do this. Const number, update number equals use state 0. Let's do yes. Let me get rid of this real quick. Let's put a number in here. Let's have a button. And when we click the button, let's go to function. We update number plus 1. So this is an awful lot of code. Let's see what it actually does. Number's going up. And let's also make another one. Increase number -1. Well, now we just have a number counter. Now we could have done this with JavaScript. We could have put event listener onto the buttons and got like the X from an ID from the HTML and changed it. And sure, but this way is much simpler. And you can see it's much more extensible to more complicated use cases. All these use cases I'm showing you right now are pretty easily done with JavaScript. You had to do it for project 2. But for much more complicated use cases, so let's say you're doing Facebook, for example, it's much more complicated, the number going up and down. React makes your life a lot easier. Really quickly, let me actually make these a functions. So const increase, an arrow function. There's no input to this. And let's just put this logic into here. So we can also use variables inside our HTML or JSX, and we can pass functions as variables, as you might learn in another computer science class, or as you might have to do in project 2. And this just has the exact same effect, right? We're just replacing the code that was in here with a name. Cool. Wait, oh, that's right. So this number right here is still X. It's not changing what actually is, it's just changing the value of X or range number. So what exactly are we doing here? So we're changing the state. So state is actually manipulating data, right? So useState is a hook. Hooks are ways that we interact with logic in React. So hooks are basically just updaters, if that makes sense. So I'm just trying to figure out the best way to explain this to someone without experience. I haven't explained hooks in a long time. So they're basically updaters. So when we use the useState hook, for example, we get out what this function puts out is a value, which is number, and updater function. This is an initial value. So our number, which we get out, will have an initial value of 0, and our updater function will just update this number. So we can see here, if we just change this to update number 1, for example. So initially number is 0 because that's the default value we passed in, and this is the updater function. If we want to change number to 1, then we pass in the value we want to change this to into the updater. Change it to 10, and it loads. Oh wait, I know why this broke. Okay, I'm not gonna explain why because it's complicated. But yeah, if you want to use an updater function, use it inside a function. I think you'll learn why exactly it broke in lecture 2. But yeah, given that we have around 10 minutes left, I'm gonna kind of gloss over that. But yeah, state, you can see here, when we click this button, we activate this function. And we change the value of number to the old value plus 1, which is why, when we increase it, which is why when we click the button, then the old number of value goes up by 1. Here, when we activate this function, after this runs, it takes the old value number, which was 1 in this case, decrements by 1, and sets a number to that. So it's kind of like number equals number minus 1, and it becomes 0 or negative, be whatever you want, right? Or let's just update number to, I don't know, hi. Cool. What happens if we subtract 1? I actually don't know. Oh, not a number. Okay, that makes sense. But yeah, JavaScript is dynamically typed, so you don't need to worry about that. We can change this to like 7.5 or whatever we want. And this is a default value, and we can change it to anything we want using this updater function. We can have multiple hooks using state. We can have number 2 and update number 2. We want to change this to number 2. We want to change this to 7 or something, right? And here we can just have number 2. And we can have as many as we want, right? And so this is our first hook that we've learned, state. To give you a better analogy, state is dynamic versus props are more static. So let's say you're building a house, right? The house is windows are like props. Those are properties of the house. The windows don't change. There is a window there. Sure, you can remove the window, but it has to be a manual effort. It's not something that happens very often. But let's look at a door. The door opens and closes, and it can't be like that, right? And it opens and closes, and that's the state of the door. The window is there. That's a property of the house. The door itself is a property of the house, but the state of the door is its state. So the props are like properties of a specific component. Those typically don't change unless you make them change, right? And even then, those tend to be a function of the higher level component, versus state is more a function of the component itself. You can see here that this home is here because I told it to from a higher level component, but this number is changing because I'm telling it to change within the component. So it's component level versus parent level. Would that make sense? All right, where is the update number function defined? Oh, I defined myself. So all that useState returns is just a variable and a function. So I decide to make the variable named number and the function named update number. I can, again, change these to whatever I want, and it'll be fine because I'm naming them myself. Does that make sense? All right. So that is your intro to React. How do you guys feel? Okay, I see thumbs up. I'll probably change once you guys get to homework, but yeah. There's definitely a lot more things that we can teach you. And there's definitely a lot more things you are going to learn. I just want to make sure I covered everything really quickly in the intro lesson. I may have missed 1 or 2 things. So let me just quickly check. Oh, I know what I can show you guys. I can help. I'll show you something I've made in React. Show you what real React looks like. Like what I made here is this is not an app bar, right? But yeah, really quickly while this is loading up, another thing you can do in React, like Python, for example, is import a bunch of things. So npm does not stand for Node Package Manager, but basically does. And you can import a bunch of packages here. So you can import NumPy JavaScript, for example, if it existed. I don't know if this exists or not. It might. But you can always download that stuff. And there's a lot of packages you use. Like if you want to do routing, right? you can't just use an A tag, or you can, but it's not recommended. You can import a router. So how do you use these things? You can't just import them. In Python, you had to pip install. In React, you had to npm install. So let's say I want to install a router. The most popular one is React Router DOM. React Router DOM. So what this does is, this will take a little bit of time, but it'll add React Router DOM as a dependency right here, and it'll add all the files associated with React Router DOM to our node modules. And so next time we want to store the app, it'll show that we need React Router DOM. And so let's say you're just pulling a React app from the internet, right? And there's no node modules, the app would crash. Okay? Let's say we remove node modules. I'm just really trying to get across the idea that React, everything that with React is in the code here. You just don't see it. So if we remove node modules, and let's try to run after that. So why is this taking so long? Lessons. Front end. Oh, I guess we had to change that to future lessons or current lessons. That was unintentional, but I'll just do it now. Man, this is annoying. Okay, cool. Okay, that's removing node modules. It's hefty. All right, yeah, I think we'll end at 15 ideally. All right, so yeah, I'd recommend reading over this, but I kind of went over this. Development speed, combining HTML, CSS, JavaScript, your app becomes faster, easier to test. Dynamic rendering, which just means it renders better. Kind of hard to explain right now. And state, which you've learned about. React developer tools, try to build React. I would recommend reading them. Node, servers, Emmet, I recommend reading over all of these. Not super important right now, given the time. Trying out React, create React app, as you saw. Anatomy of React app, run over this. Let's develop, props, and you can see here that these uses class components. So what we showed here is function components. These are called functional components by the community, and these are called class components. Class components are being phased out at the moment, and functional components with hooks are becoming a lot more popular, but class components are easier to learn if you have Java background, just because it's very similar to Java. But I'm showing you this way just because this is the modern way that people write React. But you do have to know both right now, just because hooks haven't completely replaced class components. But yeah, I'd recommend reading over this. Also, the homework I will assign over spring break will take you over this code anyway, so you don't have to look over it now. But yeah, I didn't think I missed anything. Nice. I'll just show you what I was trying to show you then. So let's see, I removed node modules. Just VS Code just being slow. But I removed node modules, just ignore that for now. And let's try to start up the app again. Let's see what happens. Cool, it broke. That's because we don't have the code for React installed anymore. We have it listed as a dependency here, but without node modules, which shouldn't be here, just VS Code being weird, we don't actually have any code for it. So in order to start up a React app, we have npm install. And all this does is install all of these dependencies into node modules so you can actually start using and writing React. All right, cool. So one last thing before we finish. So I'm going to show you what some real React looks like. Let's see. I will show you. Let's do that one. Let's do this one. So this is a nonprofit I'm working on. And so I'll show you exactly what real React looks like. And let me find a good file. So it's pretty much, so there's just a preview of what you guys will probably have to do in terms of level of complexity for your final project and your hackathon project. But you can see here, there's like a million imports. Here's our custom components. Here is our we're using Bootstrap for this. Here's our CSS import. Here's our hooks, use state and use effect. Here's some data, all this stuff, right? Here we have our file structure broken into assets, components, data, pages, routers, utils. But you see here, it's the same structure, right? Source, public, index.js, app.js, app.css, package.json, right? It's the exact same structure. It's just much more complicated. There's much more stuff in it. So typically you have much more imports. You'll have a lot of hooks because hooks and state are how you make things happen. Use effect is a hook that you'll learn in a lecture or two. And here you have a bunch of functions. So we're getting data from a database, for example. We're printing a bunch of functions to use, lots of functions, and we return our code. And once you get more into component libraries and custom components and more complex apps, you pretty much solely use custom components. So see, none of these are lowercase. So just to give another example, how you differentiate custom components from HTML components are one is uppercase, you can see your containers uppercase, versus div is lowercase. And typically these have a much more attribute. So new post is a custom component, and there's a bunch of attributes to this. And we pass in all these variables from here, all these variables that we made with state, down to this lower level component as props. And I can just scroll through here, and you can just see a bunch of code. All right, and this is a smaller file. You can see here there's a bunch of files here. And let's go to what's the scariest looking one probably. I actually wrote this pretty well, so nothing here looks super scary, I think. But yeah, here you can see another example of a React app. And there's lots of cool things here. For example, you can use styled modules, class names, Chakra UI, React Tour, React Router DOM. This is a router here. And there's just lots of stuff that goes on that you guys will learn. The power of React is that the power of React is really the community. There's lots of things that go on. All these patches are open source. The routers, the component libraries, styled modules, class names, all these things are open source. React itself is open source. And that's how things get made. React was originally made by Facebook, but really holds it up. What really creates those really cool updates and fixes all the bugs is the community. So if you ever really love React and you want to help out, you're always free to go to React GitHub. You can see all the code of how React is built and contribute. And you can become an open source developer if you want, just as easy as that. But yeah, I just guys wanted to show you guys an example of a real React app. You can see it's very complicated, but it uses the same ideas that I showed you, right? Variables in HTML. We can put functions in our HTML, custom components, passing props, state, everything in order to make a giant app. You guys know now. Yeah, I just want to emphasize that. It may seem daunting because there is a lot to it, and knowing how to use it is definitely different from just learning a theory behind it and just seeing it used in one small example. But you guys will learn this eventually, and at least for the final project, you guys will need to know this stuff and know how to be able to create these really complex apps in order to succeed and create something cool. I just really want to give you guys a quick preview of that. But yeah, that was the intro to React. Are there any questions? I can also stop recording. Give me a sec.